A long time ago, back in the 1990s, a childhood friend of mine invited me to join the team at Esoterica, a company he had founded together with a group of friends, and he thought my profile would be a good fit for the company. It was the first private internet service provider, ISP, literally set up by youngsters fresh out of university, to give the Portuguese access to the internet for a fixed cost. This was because all the operators that existed at the time basically sold the internet by the kilobyte, meaning the more people browsed, the more they viewed, and the more they downloaded to their computers, the more they paid. Mario's dream at the time was to create a fixed cost. People would pay this fixed cost and from then on could browse as much as they liked, check their emails as much as they wanted, send, receive, read the news, surf the web. The first months at Esoterica were quite literally epic, and they really were epic. At the time, we used Red Hat Linux, which was distributed on floppy disks. Just to give you an idea, it was something like 18 floppy disks, and it took a whole day to install. I vividly remember when I joined the company, and basically, the only thing I did was study day and night, relentlessly. It was all the resources I could find online about SMTP and UCP to learn everything I could about mailing news, about the various protocols, the different programs that existed at the time, and so on. There were very few resources written and published in books, but there was a publisher, O'Reilly, which had some books, usually with animals on the cover, that were literally Bibles at the time. And I remember that one of my favourites was basically the Bat book, which was the Senmile book, and I knew it back to front. I literally knew all the chapters by heart, and at the time I used to write the company's Senmile rules by hand. For anyone who's seen one of those files, it's as if literally you let a cat loose to walk across the keyboard. In other words, it's practically illegible for a layperson. My desire and need to learn went far beyond just mail and news. Basically, I had to know UNIX very well. And at the time, I studied that Linux, I studied UNIX thoroughly, to the point of also buying the reference books, the system administration books, which fascinated me, and which, a few years later, turned out to be absolutely fundamental for my career. It was a different time. 20 years ago, just to give you an idea, 20-something years ago, no one used graphical interfaces at the company. Our computers had text-based interfaces. And basically we would switch between the various consoles to manage shells. Our email client was Pine, a client that ran in text mode, but basically 99.999% of the work was done solely in text-based interfaces. When I joined Esoterica, I had nearly 10 years experience programming in C, and about 3 years in C++, roughly speaking. This was because on the Amiga there was a compiler called SASC. I started programming on it very early, made a few games on it, and so on. Well, if it was written in C, nothing in C frightens me. Nothing at all. And if it even comes with the source code, I thought it was going to be a piece of cake. Even a small Unix is gigantic. And it's very difficult for anyone to know everything about it, from end to end. But with a lot of dedication, many hours of work, let's say, I became a bit of a guru at the time in Unix, and I fell in love with the system. Even today, all the systems I admire are Unix systems. Frankly, I think I've never studied as much in my life as I did in the first 3 or 4 months at Esoterica. It was an absolutely fantastic challenge. There's nothing better for developing a person than giving them a big problem to solve and all the means to resolve it. People who are committed and who enjoy technology, this is extremely important. If people like and understand technology, they'll pick up those books, that body of know-how, and they'll solve the problem. But more than that, they'll solve the problem in a thorough way, covering every step of that solution. One example I remember perfectly was the IMAP and POP3 authentication server we used. It didn't work properly. So when Esoterica reached 10,000 or 20,000 clients, I can't remember the exact number, the authentication system started to fail. And what we discovered was that if we changed the way we did authentication, we could solve the whole problem, because all the issues were in the programming, specifically in those authentication plugins. And this was discovered by looking at the code, understanding the code, and solving the problem in an effective and comprehensive way. A lot of credit goes to Antonio Ferreira for the way that problem was solved at the time. He was the first person to discover it. I then went to look in depth at exactly what it was about. The first solution was to switch off that authentication mode, and then I fixed the problem at the time. Those first few months at Esoterica were extraordinary for me. To Mario, who helped me so much in those first months, and who was by my side throughout that time, I'll say he had to distance himself from the hardware, the servers, and the underlying problems that existed. This was because he had to endure the little nightmare of being the manager and CEO of the company. And the word nightmare doesn't even begin to describe the sea of crap he found himself in. Basically, when he was dealing with that side of things, sorting out the issues. Linux, the various protocols, technical problems, bugs, and so on, Mario was having to deal with tedious things like salaries, sales, deadlines, and lawsuits from Portugal Telecom for operating without a license. Basically, anything tedious ended up falling squarely on his shoulders. I've never seen anyone so stressed and pushed to the very limits of human endurance as Mario. And at that time, paradoxically, he was surrounded by well-off people. All of them doing the most delightful things in the world, the sort of thing a geek loves to do, dealing with and solving technical problems. Which must make it even harder, because when you live in that nightmare and surrounded by people who only get to do the fun stuff, I imagine it's not the most pleasant position to be in. He was extremely stressed, sometimes clashing with people inside the company, and he had very little patience for people's desperation, which is normal. I mean, when you're living under enormous stress and then you see people in some way failing around you, obviously you're not going to like it, are you? That didn't affect me in the slightest. Mario was someone I met 15 years ago. When he shouted at me, I shouted back at him. We both shouted. And if there's one thing Mario does, it's that he's profoundly authentic in his dealings with people. The shouting is everything that needs to be said. And if people know how to listen to what needs to be said and eventually respond, he knows how to take it on the chin. And the problem is sorted there and then. If you think it's hard to start a startup today, you can't imagine what the scene was like 20 years ago. You really can't imagine it at all. Because there weren't any investor fairs or startup hubs where people could get their business off the ground. None of that existed. Basically, setting up a company with the characteristics of a startup today, at that time it meant going around begging money from friends and family who believed in you, putting all your eggs in one basket, and if that horse made it to the finish line, brilliant. People would get their money back. If it didn't make it, tough luck. They lost everything. And the person who went asking for the money had to answer for it, explaining that they'd lost that money. The truth is, the founders of the company and the people who hired me never stopped paying me a salary. They never let me down in any way whatsoever. I did my best not to let them down in the things that were my responsibility, but I'm fully aware that what they did is far more impressive than anything I managed to do. I started out after having studied and begun to manage mail and news servers by doing a huge amount of technical support at the company. If it was needed, everyone would pitch in a bit, but the bulk of the technical support was done by me and Gonzalo Valverde. He had far more patience. People's ignorance, combined with the attitude of I'm paying so I'm the customer, is a combination that typically gets on my nerves. Because ignorance I can deal with by explaining to people how things work. But arrogance I can't. I can't deal with conceit either. And when people are excessively arrogant or conceited, they find it hard to learn. Aside from many comical episodes, I hated every second of speaking to anyone on the phone during that period. It got to the point where, fed up with dealing with customers, I went to speak to Mario and Luis Cara at the time and told them I resign because I'm not putting up with these people. The part one lie to do, if you want my service, is dealing with the technological side. I don't know what conversation Mario had with Luis at the time, but basically they decided to hand me over the company's research and development. In other words, you go off to a corner, isolate yourself, you don't have to deal with customers, but you look after the mail.in news servers and you have to create products for the company to sell. Going back a bit, and even before research and development, let me just tell you some absolutely delightful stories from when I was doing support. Technical support, that is. All sorts used to happen to me. At the time, Windows didn't have support for TCP/IP. So there was a program called Trumpet. When Trumpet established a connection, a little clock would appear in the middle of the screen showing how long the person had been connected. And so I had someone ring me once in the middle of the morning explaining, I'm going to be very direct with you. I've already realised this is all a scam. To which I replied, but why do you think it's a scam? What exactly is a scam? This internet you've sold me isn't really the internet. All right, I admit that at the time I was a bit confused, and I asked the gentleman to explain himself a bit better. What exactly was he referring to? So he says, don't think I'm stupid because I set everything up exactly as you said. A clock appeared on the screen and the first thing I noticed was this clock. That's not possible. And he explained to me because I'm not stupid. And I understand that the internet works at all hours because it's a global thing, but the minutes are wrong. So this isn't the internet, this is fake. Well, I then explained to the gentleman that it wasn't a clock. It was a stopwatch that was measuring the time since it had been switched on. So the gentleman explained to me that the computer had been on practically all night while he was waiting for something to happen. And then he told me, and that's when I was certain it was a scam, because it's always daytime somewhere. There must be something happening. And I was there for hours and nothing happened. Well then, the gentleman thought the internet was like television. In other words, he would connect to the internet and watch things. He never opened any browser, any email program, nothing at all. The only thing he did was look at the clock, waiting for a broadcast to appear. That was one. Equally impressive was the number of customers who called me saying, "Oh, I bought your kit, I've got your floppy disks here. I put this in, but nothing works." To which we would usually try to do some debugging. So you put it in, installed it, did it show up, etc., etc. And then the modems. Which lights were on the modem? Modem? Yes, the device that's connected to the telephone to establish the connection. I haven't got anything like that. This happened. Look. Another thing that used to happen to me, and this isn't human stupidity, nor is it just funny, was that people would ring up asking if we sold witchcraft kits. Because of the company name, Esoterica, among the people who had their technical problems, there were also phone calls from people ordering buttons, black magic, all sorts of things you can imagine, typically related to esotericism. And there were some customers who were quite original in the requests they made, which was so absurd that sometimes it took people a while to take in the request and try to understand what the person was actually saying. For example, there was a customer who insisted, if I'm not mistaken, it was with Mario Valente in person. In one of the calls he answered, because everyone did a bit of support, some more than others. And I remember that the chap said to Mario Valente something along the lines of, "Just send me some floppy disks by fax." And I can clearly recall the look on his face, staring into space, pausing and thinking, how do I explain to this chap that I can't send a floppy disk? And this sort of thing happened. These kinds of things happen practically every day. Not everything has a funny side to it. In the midst of these support calls, I discovered that there were people who were so deeply lonely, they would ring the company literally inventing problems just to have someone to talk to. And I remember feeling sorry for those people and thinking it must be profoundly sad that there are people whose only human company they can have is by calling a technical helpline at a company that sells internet access. I remember one case in particular of a gentleman who had agoraphobia, couldn't leave the house, was afraid of open spaces, and practically every day for about a week or so would call up, always making up more or less original problems, thinking that things weren't happening as quickly as he wanted. And it took me a while to realize what was going on, but it was just another of those cases of people who were so deeply lonely that a technical support line was all they had. During the period when I was doing research and development at the company, I wrote software to monitor servers. Literally, it would make the sound of a siren locally, like the fire brigade, and would send pagers to the technician who was on call. A pager? Asked some of the younger lot. Pagers were the equivalent of the text messages that everyone has on their mobiles today, but which didn't exist back then. In other words, we had a little box that allowed us to receive short written messages with the typical characteristics of an SMS, and which I used to get messages to whoever was on duty that night. Any problem that occurred with any of the servers. The pager would be passed around between the various technicians in the company. And there was one time when I was on call and at 2 a.m. I get a message. New server down. My thought was, right, this isn't critical, I'll check what it is in a bit. Web server down. Half an hour later. Right, web server. That's a bit more important. There are people who have pages hosted here at the company, and I need to get this up and running quickly. So I started heading towards my computer to connect a modem, access Esoterica, and then sort the problem remotely. Hadn't even taken 3 steps. Mail server down. Whoa, hang on. Everything's suddenly going down. What on earth kind of night is this? I took another step. DNS server down. Well, without DNS, literally. There isn't a single service working among the popular services on the internet. Right, I turned to my wife and said I'd have to go out, grab me DT. I lived about 5 or 6 minutes away from Esoterica by motorbike, so I got on my DT, it was just gone 2 in the morning, and I shot off towards the company, which was in the Benfica office centre. The company was split across 2 locations. That is, there was an office where everyone worked, in a building next to the office centre, and the data centre, where the Portugal telecom lines came in and all the original servers were set up, was in the Benfica office centre. I went there, unlocked the various doors. There were like 2 glass doors or something like that. I went in, opened both doors, switched on the lights and went to the room. When I opened the door to the room, there was nothing. There were cables scattered all over the floor. And the first thing that crossed my mind was, did someone decide to move the servers at 2 in the morning to the new offices? Well, no one told me absolutely anything, and there I was like an idiot on call, getting those pages and leaving the house at this hour. I pick up the phone, there was a phone there, so I stay and call Mario Valente. I call him and start the conversation, slightly furious, by saying that if they were going to make changes today, they should have let me know, because it's completely idiotic. The person on call not knowing about it. And he replied to me in a very calm voice, as you'd expect from someone answering the phone at 2 in the morning, and said, "Calm down, what are you talking about?" And I said, they'd been moving the machines without telling me. I mean, I have the pager, which starts receiving alerts saying that all the machines are down. Mate, I thought it was a problem. I get here and they've taken the servers. Mario goes silent and with a literally controlled urgency says, "Where are you, Paulo? Are you in the server room?" To which he replied, "I am, of course, and the servers aren't there." Asked Mario, "Now I'm searching. The staff should already be in the new office. You received the pages, haven't you?" And I said, "Man, about 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes, I don't know. I even got on the motorcycle and came this way. Were all the services starting to go down?" "Well, Paulo, yes, we're being robbed. They must still be there at the office centre with you, so be careful. I'm going to call the police and head over there." And I hung up the phone, leaving silence on the line. And suddenly, I noticed that the silence in the office centre and that empty room where the machines used to be suddenly had all my attention. I turned, closed the door to the room, locked myself inside, my mind racing at 200 miles an hour. I began to map out scenarios and assess the situation I was in. The thought of being in the office centre, which was a labyrinth of dark corridors, literally with people who were stealing. The office centre put me in obvious and imminent danger. A few minutes went by, must have been 5 or 10 minutes. Mario also lived relatively close by in Benfica, and I started to hear noises. Fortunately, it was Mario arriving. He came to meet me in the room. The police still hadn't arrived, no, and the 2 of us left the office centre and waited for the police outside the door. Mario insisted that the thieves must still be in the office centre. They're still inside, some of them. Because Mario's idea was, if you only took 10 or 15 minutes to get here, and there are so many rooms, it's most likely that they were caught off guard by someone coming in and locked themselves in the room they were in. And I thought he was having a nervous breakdown. In fact, it made perfect sense for him to be in denial, because, he was the one who had given his all, put his skin in the game, and, well, in my view, at that moment, it was already history. The company had ceased to exist, because without servers, what was going to happen the next day was that it would be impossible to restore services. So, in my head, what I was thinking was, okay, I'm unemployed, but above all, my friend of 15 years, half a lifetime at that point, well, he lost everything he had staked. And I think I'd never felt so sorry for anyone as I did at that moment. But I didn't have the courage to say that he was in denial. So we waited for the police. The police arrived and, after a quick briefing, went to check the state of the office centres. They started checking place by place, office by office, room by room. And to my surprise, they came outside saying that we'd caught the thieves. They were in a basement, with a van with various things they'd already stolen, without having had the chance to leave. So, they were cool. Mario was right. His gut feeling was spot on. And I remember looking at him, not only with deep admiration for his ability to piece things together and predict what would happen, but above all, with admiration because he wasn't in denial. He was simply being rational and kept his cool throughout the whole process, which was absolutely fantastic. But hours later, it must have been 4 or 5 in the morning, the police returned the stolen equipment to us. That night was literally spent recovering the servers and getting everything back up and running. When dawn broke, when the sun rose, we had a company up and running again. And sure enough, it was nearly 9 in the morning when I went home after having spent an absolutely unique night, but with the comfort of knowing that everything was working. I only went back to the company at about 4 or 5 in the afternoon the next day. And that was an evening spent telling colleagues and the people who were there exactly what had happened. Less than a year after I joined Esoterica, Mario left the company. I didn't speak to him much. In fact, during the period I worked with him, it must have been the time I spoke to Mario the least in my entire life. And that's normal, because for all intents and purposes, Mario was my boss. When two friends are boss and employee, there's always a certain distance, a gap. Allowing friendship to get in the way of the normal company hierarchy, in the way people interact. But even today, exactly the same kind of distance is maintained when people who aren't very close are working at the company. My relationship with the new management of the company, with the remaining original partners, was neither good nor bad. I had a few problems and a few disagreements with Nuno and Antonio, but they were always resolved at the time. I never took anything home with me. I never left anything unsaid, not a single thing, and vice versa. So between decent people who understand each other, things are said, taken on board, and the problem is sorted, resolved there and then. And that's exactly what always happened. Even though the company ended up better off, for me personally, he was the reference point, the reason why I had embarked on that adventure. So when he left, I was caught by surprise. I had no idea he was about to leave. And although I do appreciate that, in fact the atmosphere became much better. In other words, Antonio's leadership involved less shouting, less stress, a different way of dealing with people. And I think most people welcomed Mario's departure. Mario was absolutely essential in the work he did there during his time at the company. Without him, there wouldn't have been a company at all, that's for sure. But the fact is, once those initial barriers were overcome, with companies already investing, money coming in and so on, the kind of leadership he had, which was the best he could offer, well, I have absolutely no doubt about it. He deserves a great deal of credit for what he did. It was a bit like Steve Jobs from Apple. People were afraid to get in the lift with him. People were scared to confront him. But Mario's departure, for me, was a countdown. I knew I would want to leave the company, regardless of whether people wanted me to stay or not. And after 3 or 4 months, I left